In these videos, we are talking about all kinds of things related to Paul's methodology, his strategy, and all of them, I believe, are helpful and important. But we're about to jump into a series of 3 topics now that I believe are actually the critical core of Paul's approach to missions. And we should be paying attention to Paul here because how he goes about his ministry is actually quite different than how most people in ministry go about their ministry. And I think these are really, again, the critical core, the most important pieces. And if we don't get these right, then the other things are not really going to help us as much. So let's first of all talk about Paul, the proclaimer. And this is about declaring the good news of Jesus. Well, actually, Paul talks about 3 ministry roles. And let's look at how he sort of describes this in 1 Timothy. Because first, he talks about his old life. He says, God considered me faithful, putting me into service, even though I was formerly, before coming to Christ, a blasphemer. He was taking strong verbal stances against Jesus being the Messiah, being the Son of God, and he was blaspheming by his strong proclamations. And he was a persecutor. He was, as we know, on his way to Damascus to find Christians and bring them back to Jerusalem in chains. And it's likely that they could have been either be thrown in prison for long term or perhaps killed for their faith and their preaching of the good news. And then he describes himself as a violent aggressor. He wasn't just speaking out against this movement. He was perhaps the leading hothead who actually is pushing for physical aggression against the church. He wants to destroy this before it gets any worse. This is what Paul says about his life before Christ. And then he says, "For this, then, I was appointed as a servant of God." First, a proclaimer. He has a message. It is the gospel, and he is the one who is supposed to announce it to the nations, to as many places as he can go where Christ has not been proclaimed yet. And we see this is the foundation of everything else. Today, in the established church circles, we often do ministry that is based on great organization and resources, maybe financial resources and professional resources, all kinds of things. In missions, we really need to make sure that we begin with telling lost people about Jesus. That's really where missions gets accomplished, and that is the first thing that Paul says is his particular role. And then he doesn't just lead them to Christ. He's a teacher. He's going to teach those who come to faith, and as he says, he wants to perfect them. And now he is doing what we might refer to as discipleship. But that's not all that he does. He's not just an evangelist and a discipler. We see there's a lot of people in the world who focus on one or both of those, who don't go on to accomplish what Paul did. Everywhere Paul went to preach and make disciples, he planted a church. And I believe as he describes his calling to be an apostle to the church in Corinth, he connects it to the fact that he came to Corinth and he is essentially the founder of that church there. So when Paul says, "I'm an apostle," his understanding of accomplishing the Great Commission always ends with a church being planted that continues the ministry in that place. And that is the overwhelming New Testament model that we see in Acts and in all of the epistles. So Paul is a proclaimer of the gospel, a teacher of new believers, and an apostle who plants churches among the nations. And all of this is done in faith and in truth. Now, Paul actually uses these three descriptors again in 2 Timothy, a proclaimer, a teacher, and an apostle. And that's what we're going to be focusing on in these next series of videos, because this, I believe, is the core piece of the whole methodology of Paul. Well, again, we're talking about proclamation. We're talking about telling people about Jesus. And so what I see in Paul begins with contact for the gospel. In fact, in 1 Thessalonians, he talks about making contact, getting an entryway into the community, into the people there in Thessalonica. And it seems through the story, if we look at it carefully, Paul is carefully choosing places he could gain a hearing for his message. He's not only entering a city physically, I mean, he's in most cases probably walking literally into that city, he's doing that, but he's also thinking, and he expresses himself in terms of entering into the audience. I think this is one of the most important things that missionaries ought to know and ought to develop skills at. In the established church, we're often waiting on people to come to us. We have a big building, we have a program, we have special events, we have a well-known pastor, all of those kinds of things. We're waiting for people to come to us. We're not actually going out to them. Well, missions is going out to them. And that begins with, let me find places and ways in which I can make this initial contact with people, and in many cases very quickly then begin to share the gospel with them. So how did Paul go about doing this? Well, we see in numerous places in Acts that he spoke in synagogues. Now, probably in Paul's particular case, he's thinking about his own background. He is a true Old Testament scholar. He studied with one of the greatest Old Testament scholars in the history of Judaism. And there are Jews there. And Paul's concerned about the Jews. I mean, he knows his calling is to get to the nations. But, he expresses his strong hope and desire that the Jews will come to faith also. And he knows they've got this Old Testament just like he does. And he's an expert in that Old Testament. And so at the synagogue, they're going to be Jews. And he's hoping that he's going to win some of them to follow Jesus. And in synagogues all over the Roman Empire and in Greek cities, there were non-Jews there, perhaps who weren't quite ready to become Jews, with all of that implies, but were really drawn to this God of the Jews, this Yahweh, this Creator God. And so Paul is finding people who are, in the New Testament terms, God-fearers. They're not God followers yet, but they are God-fearers, and this message of Jesus is extremely powerful to them. So what better place for him to start if he's going to get invited to speak, and he's an expert, and no one there's more of an expert on the Old Testament than he himself is, and then he's got several types of audiences through which he can maybe gain entry and get believers that are then going to open up all kinds of other communities there in that particular city. We know that Paul shared the gospel in homes. And this is still one of the best ways to make contact with people around the world. Meet somebody, If you get invited to their home, by all means go, drink tea, eat biscuits. If they bring you a little meal, then oh my goodness, thank them and eat whatever they put in front of you, as Jesus told his disciples twice. The first time was for the disciples, and the second time was for Americans who don't like to eat anything else that they don't know from home. But you get into a home, and now the beauty of this is, this was true in the Roman world. Most people had almost complete freedom to do whatever they wanted to do in their home. The government was not concerned about whatever religious activities in the home. That was under in most cases, the man of the house, and he was king of his castle. And so once you're inside the house, you have tremendous freedom and privacy to share deeply with a whole household. And many households would be much bigger than we think of in American culture. They might be several generations, there might be servants there might be business associates, there may be extended family, there may be close neighbors who just sort of also rotate in and out of that household because of deep friendships. So, and we've seen this work overseas with student teams going to places like India, where it is very common we get invited into a house, and if we were trying to preach on the streets, we would get in trouble and maybe escorted out of the country. But when some little lady or some man says, "Why don't you come to my house? I want to hear more about you," and you start sharing the gospel there, they go and get all their friends and neighbors. And sometimes we've had students who've shared for 2 or more hours with 30 or more people all crowded there, and that is actually one of the best places. Paul's doing that in Acts, and it still works in so many places around the world today where people are hospitable. Now, if there's not much hospitality in the culture, as in much of contemporary America, this is going to be more of a challenge. It still works if you could just get into the home. So Paul's doing that. He's figured out places where he can talk to people about Jesus. Now, in most of the places where Paul went, he was working with his hands during the day, and you set up in the market. If you can sort of think of a huge flea market where people are actually working, making things all over the place, that the market would sort of be that. It's more than a mall. It's all of your food that you buy. It's probably any cloth or clothes that you buy. It's essentially everything, and it was usually in the center of the city. And that's where Paul would be sitting and working. And this was considered the normal place to discuss things like politics and religion, the weather, almost anything. You could start conversations with people. This is where people came every day. They bought some things or made some things, according to what their need was. But they're also exchanging information in this place. It was a natural place, and Paul fit naturally into this system of the marketplace in the cities where he went. So right here, we've already got 3 amazing places where Paul is making contact with people that might continue in an ongoing discussion about the gospel after that, but at least here's where he could get it started. So he also proclaimed in public whenever that was practical, whenever it was possible. And sometimes it happened because he was in trouble. And a whole crowd had gathered because Paul had said something, or there's a lie circulating about what Paul's doing or saying. So in Acts 14, we get him speaking publicly at the gates of Lystra. A whole crowd is there. And even when it was dangerous, it appears Paul always grabbed these moments to spread this news to the whole community as best that he could. In Philippi, he goes to the prayer place down by the river. Maybe there was not a synagogue there. And so, again, this would be looking for people who are interested in Yahweh and who are already religious enough to be praying, but they're probably not Jews. And he found a good group of people who were open to his message there. Obviously, in Athens, he's actually called to trial. When he goes to the Areopagus, we think of it as, oh, well, it was a philosophical discussion or Paul's opportunity to preach to the city. No, essentially, he was on trial for introducing a God that had not been approved by the central council who oversaw religious things in the city. So he's on trial, but there's a huge group of people there, including most of the leaders. So, oh my goodness, Paul certainly takes advantage of this opportunity in the most learned city in Greek life. They find a hall, a Tyrannus. It's basically a school. It was not being used. Maybe it was being used part of the time, but not all the time. So Paul starts preaching there on a regular basis, and the whole city's hearing about it, and they know they can come there, on any day and probably hear Paul telling about this Jesus and what he's done. In Acts 21, he's on the steps of the fortress where basically he's being, they're thinking they're going to take him there to punish him, probably to scourge him or something. But he gets an opportunity to publicly declare who he is and what his message is, and he takes it right there on the steps of the fortress. And we see in the latter part of Acts, he is under arrest. There are multiple courts and kings, perhaps eventually even the emperor, that he's going to get a chance to talk to. And Paul takes those moments to preach Jesus. Even though, again, he's the one who's sort of on trial here. In his view, he might win a king. He might get this broad hearing, and he's going to take that opportunity. So, considering the fact that he was often in trouble when this was happening, Paul is quite bold. He wanted the gospel out person to person. He wanted it in small groups, like in homes. But whenever there's a whole crowd and we could announce this to a much greater number of people, Paul is going to grab that opportunity. Now, it's interesting that as we read the story in Acts 19, there is one place that Paul did not proclaim the gospel. And we might have missed it because Paul doesn't mention it anywhere. We might have missed it, but it's certainly true. This is the pattern. It never mentioned anywhere that Paul went to the temple of Artemis in Ephesus, the greatest. I mean, it's one of the wonders of the world. It must have been a huge and beautiful temple there. He never went there, a pagan temple, to preach about Jesus. And that's what the city leaders say. Look, this man has not been going into our temples and preaching the gospel in these places and declaring all these idols are a waste of time. He sort of does that in the Areopagus because he got invited and we was forced to come. But this is not what Paul's doing. I think that's really important for us to remember. I think we want to do unto others as they would have us do unto them, and I just think that it would be disrespectful. I would not want somebody from another religion walking into worship on a Sunday morning and declaring some other message in my worship place. So Paul doesn't do that, and even though it would have been a huge public crowd to do that, he does not do that, and I think that's really important. So again, we're seeing all kinds of ways in the story that Paul is making contact with the people that he's trying to talk to.